Matt Sherman was a standout in high school. He had a sharp sense of humor that can still bring a smile to my face 30 years later when I think about him. He would dare to do things that most people wouldn't. Although we didn't keep close contact through the years, it was always easy to assume that Matt would build a life that would be interesting. This conversation did not disappoint. Matt's education is available in the bio. It is lengthy and impressive. These credentials, along with his personal relationships, built through his work with people like General Colin Powell during Powell's time outside of government service, helped create the opportunity for him to have his tours as a civilian advisor in Iraq and Afghanistan. It would seem that Matt's unique charismatic personality helped him build relationships with all types of players on all sides of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. His resulting perspective would inform the key decision-makers in both wars. The list of people he advised includes General Stanley McChrystal, General David Petraeus, and General John F Campbell. I'm grateful Matt was willing to share his perspectives and experiences in the following conversation. New to this podcast is the contribution of my friend and fellow pilot, Chad Hinkson. Chad agreed to join in this and some future conversations I'll be having. Chad's perspective is something I've appreciated over the past decade. Normally, these podcasts only have minor edits where I delete out various annoying sounds and utterances and words like and or as I'm grasping for words. Normally, you hear the conversation straight through. We've made an exception in this case to move one part of the conversation to the very front. As Matt and I went back and forth for about 90 minutes, Chad asked a pertinent question. How did Matt get into his present situation? So the first 9.5 minutes of this conversation start with what happened about an hour and a half into the conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Chad, you got anything?
Actually, yeah, I have a lot. At some point we need to circle back and talk about how did you get involved with this?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah. As Scott knows from high school, I wasn't the most stellar student. I graduated 160 out of 180 in our class. I was just like, it was like whether I was going to college was kind of debatable. And I was more into like BMX and mountain bike racing at the time and doing all that other stuff. I lost a sponsor that I had. And I decided, and my parents wanted me to go to college. And I was like, I don't need to go to college. College is a pain in the ass. And I lost a sponsor that I had. And I applied to some colleges. And I only got accepted to one college, Nichols College in Dudley, Massachusetts. And if you look on the Barron's list, it's like a very less competitive. And we always wonder about the people who didn't get into Nichols. But it was the only school that gave me a chance. And so I went there for a year. And I'm an obsessive. If you haven't been able to tell, I'm a bit of an obsessive. And kind of like I started shifting to kind of like going, well, maybe I should start studying a little bit. And academics kind of slowly became an obsession of mine. And I had some teachers that really kind of helped me out and helped me kind of, how do you refocus on things and how to study and all this other stuff. And I was like, that's good. And I did decent my first year. I did decent, particularly my first semester. And I then and I transferred. And I transferred because I can't stay at Nichols for 4 years. I got to do something. I'm also impatient. And so I applied to a bunch of schools and I transferred to University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And it's a bigger school. They have more things to do. And I was able to kind of develop academically, personally, socially, mature a little bit. And I progressively did well. And then after a year or so, I then said, let me see if I can transfer again. And I transferred then to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I was just like shooting on all cylinders and just kind of did incredibly well. Now, I would have never gotten in there to begin with, but had I started there, I would have just been overwhelmed by the whole thing and done horribly. But that progression allowed me to mature. And so I did very well. And I graduated in December, and I was thinking at grad schools, and I got accepted to graduate school at Cambridge in England, but they start in October. And so then I had 10 months pretty much to kill. And I knew I liked international relations and history and politics a bit. And so I wanted to, I tried can I join the military for 6 months or 10 months, and you couldn't do that. Marines have something now where you can join between your junior, or at least they did, between your junior, senior year or in summer. I said, can I join the Peace Corps? And couldn't do that because that's 2 years. And there's a whole application process. And so I applied for 2 internships. And I said, let me do one at the federal level, at the state level, initially from New Jersey, and one at the one with a Republican and one with a Democrat. And so I did my first 5 months in the Clinton White House. And that was fascinating in the press section. And then I did the second 5 months in Christy Whitman's office, helping out with a small little piece of legislation for deaf and disabled people who suffer from drug and alcohol abuse. And it was fascinating. And I was able to make a whole bunch of contacts and all this other stuff. And then I went to grad school for 2 years. And then from the contacts I made at the White House, I worked with a small little nonprofit called America's Promise that was headed up by Colin Powell, by General Powell. And that then gave me another, and he kind of helped me out, and people around him helped me out, knew that I was interested in doing politics and international relations. So he kind of got me involved in some of the things that he was doing, was able to help out on the nonprofit side. They helped out at-risk kids. And so it was another kind of step. But it was from those relationships that I made that then led to what I had, not knowing what was going to happen. Then I went to law school for a few years, hated law school, just absolutely hated it. And back in North Carolina, practiced law for a year and a half, hated it, did corporate law, good people there, but just hated every 6 minutes of my time having to bill it and all this other stuff. I hated it so much I went to Iraq. I was like, let me just quit and go to Iraq. And because at the time, this is 2003. So the war kicked off in March. The Iraq war did, I think in March or April of 2003. And shortly thereafter, they were looking for people to go over there because they thought they would need civilians to go over there. And there was a push to do that. And long story short, it was a lot more difficult than what it sounds, is that I ended up being able to go out there, not really knowing what I would do, but quitting my job at the law firm for a 6-month gig. It was literally a 6-month assignment in Baghdad. And me then just finding finding my zone where I'm like, when things are going crazy, I like get calm. And it was, I had to deal with international relations and politics. And I'm like, all right, this is interesting. I can coordinate and network like there's no tomorrow. And I was in a place that allowed to do it. So there was a whole bunch of environmental things that kind of suited to my personality. And you're living in a very austere environment, and I don't have much, and I'm not a material guy. And so it just kind of clicked with me. And I was very good at what I did. And I was in this position that a lot of the career people didn't take because it wasn't something that you progressed up in these positions that were created. They were created just for short-term work, but I kind of found a way of making it all substantive and important. And I just met a bunch of people and it progressed from there. And I did 6 months. Then I got pushed to a year, and I did another year, and then I was burned out, and I took a break for 8 months or 9 months and went mountain climbing. And then some general that I knew from the first year says, "You want to go back out?" And I'm like, "Sure. What else am I going to do?" And went out, and then left, and then tried flailing around doing consulting work and all this other stuff. And then people was like, "You want to go to Afghanistan?" I'm like, "Oh, that'll broaden my expertise, and because the State Department and the military and the Defense Department started up these short-term employment sort of work because when Powell was Secretary of State, he tried to reform the Foreign Service, which is one of the main bodies within the State Department, and he couldn't make as much progress as he wanted. But there's a compromise of where we'll bring in new blood, but they could only work in these positions for a short period of time, so they wouldn't threaten the career people. And so they were able to hire hundreds of people, thousands in some cases, thousands of people, particularly what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, in a short period of time. But they'd be in these positions that aren't necessarily, career enhancing. but given what I knew and given how I kind of, again, found these seams and these gray spaces, I was able to make them much more critical than a lot. And I was able to stay there a lot longer than a lot of the career people who would then rotate in and out after 6 months or a year or whatever. And I would just stay. And that kind of added to the whole my capability, the value that I would bring to people I worked with. So that's a rough thing, but it was all, I've learned the best things in life happen when you least expect them. There are things where I thought I would do this in my life and do this, and none of those things have ever panned out. None of them. And I just and it was something I just evolved into. It was never anything that I planned whatsoever. I don't think anyone would plan to be in war zones for a decade. That's again a long answer to your short question.
No, that's great. That's a great answer.
I am so thankful, grateful, and honored that you would actually have this, set aside this time.
I'm happy to do this. This is when you told me about it, I was like, that sounds like good fun. It's a good way to reconnect with people and learn more about other folks. And I was just telling my dad recently about some of the interviews you were doing and what Mike Martz has been your first one. And he was like, oh, that's really interesting, and that you reached out to me and we hadn't spoken in decades, but it was just like we're picking right up where we left off.
I don't know what type of psychological theories you buy into. Last time we talked about Viktor Frankl, but I've kind of got this mental model that, like we like to think we roll through life as these unified personalities with just like, that we do things for one motivation. But I kind of buy into the theory that we've got all of these competing motivations inside of us that motivate us to do things. And I'll be honest, and, I hope it doesn't seem being too opportunistic or whatnot, but when all that shit was going down in Afghanistan at the end of August, and I have been putting out these podcasts, I thought if I could talk to Matt Sherman right now to help me, I asked you for that, like, what could I read up on Afghanistan and whatnot so I could sound smarter when talking with you? Personally, how I'd like to come at this is like from my state of ignorance, from the shared collective American ignorance that is our discussions of Afghanistan right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kind of give a bit of an overview of how I see it. And the issue with Afghanistan, it's nothing simple and it's very complex. And unless you're kind of like immersed in stuff, you miss a lot of the nuance. And even though I've been involved in it for many, many years, I miss a lot of things. And I don't have a full context. That's one of the things I'm drawn to these areas is that it's kind of like a incredibly complex problem sets. And that's what I've always been attracted to is like incredible complex problems. Actually, I just like banging my head against the wall all the time, I guess. And but Afghanistan's historically, that's why I kind of like recommended that one book too that kind of gives a pre 9/11 history. I always wish in these areas, I wish I could have been, in Afghanistan, during the Taliban era or during the 60s or during different areas to kind of gain a perspective because it changes. And as you said, we all change and we evolve or devolve. I'm glad I evolved a little bit from high school. And with Afghanistan, historically, it's a very, very complex and combative area, given just how the geography of it. I think we're talking even longer. I think geography plays a huge role in how nations develop their history, or how just regions develop their history. Our nations, develop because of our geography. If you just think of the oceans that we have on each side, that helped us remain relatively safe for centuries. The mountain ranges create certain, Colorado really, the mountain ranges there create certain history. The Mississippi River creates certain history. Afghanistan is a very mountainous and diverse geography. And as a result, you have these different tribal and ethnic entities throughout the whole area. And it's always been an area of conflict. And then you also have Pakistan. So you have that whole region, which is historically very, very combative, and it's rarely calm for any extended period of time, meaning more than 50 years. And so literally for the past 40 years, it's been in a state of civil war. Afghanistan has. And we got involved, of course, because of 9/11. And I've always been of the opinion that a lot of these transnational terrorist groups, or these terrorist groups which have now become transnational because of technologies, can emanate from that part of the world. And we Americans need to have some sort of presence there because of, again, what happened with 9/11, because of other groups, and also because you've got countries in the region like Pakistan that are nuclear powers, and that's a true geostrategic issue. And so this is why I always thought, regardless of whether you think we did the right thing or the wrong thing, which people on both sides have got very reasonable and well thought out arguments, I thought we need to have some sort of presence there to manage the issue. You're never going to fix Afghanistan. And also to make sure that we're able to kind of mitigate some of these transnational terrorist groups, and also to make sure that things don't go completely sideways in Pakistan, which is at times a very unstable country, so that you don't have a nuclear exchange, and which is a real, potentially a real problem. And I was of the opinion that you need to have some sort of force presence there for generations, similar to what we had for a while in Germany, similar to what we have now in Korea, just to kind of keep kind of things at least at a relative simmer.
On that note, a retort or a response that I have often heard said, which, only since August and the pullout and the calamity that went on there, but in refutation of the idea that we need to pull out there, we can't be in these forever wars, yada, yada, yada. The point had been made that, and I'm not sure if this is exactly true, but that we had no American casualties from February of 2020 until August of 2021 with the pullout, which would seem to speak to. Do you see it as that was sign that we were at some type of stable situation? And then another, listen, I, the purpose of me having this conversation with you is you can hopefully help unfuck my understanding of it, which is clouded by all of the popular zeitgeist right now. And the one side saying we can't be involved in these forever wars. And then other people saying, well, we could stay there and it could have been stabilized, which I think I was just hearing you say something towards that end. But then, everyone wants to throw the blame around. In the blame game of things that get thrown around was, well, Trump released 5,000, Taliban prisoners. And towards what extent did issues like that exacerbate the situation?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm providing my perspective, and I haven't been back there in 4 years, 5 years almost, more than 5 years. And I try to shy away from saying, if we did this, it would have been better. We did that, it would have been whatever. My initial point was that Afghanistan's been unstable for decades. And regardless if we stayed there or not, it would still be unstable to a degree. And you're correct. We hadn't had any casualties for a number of years. Part of that's in line with, we had some sort of tentative agreement with the Taliban that there would be kind of a relative cessation of conflict for maybe the past year or so that we wouldn't actively attack one another. But if all of a sudden something happened, we maintained the right of self-defense. So that, I think, contributed a little bit towards why you hadn't seen any U.S. casualties over the past year or so. Having said that, the casualties over the past 5 years and more have been relatively small in comparison to the environment and the number of troops you have there. Okay, break. Point number two, and this is a wider issue that kind of gets lost on a lot of people, and it gets lost on me sometimes, is we throw around these words like war, forever war. It's kind of a narrative. Narratives are important for better and for worse, but they're important. And we, America and the West, NATO, for the most part, have done a very poor job at defining, what winning is. If we've won the war. These wars that we're in, at least in the modern era, or the past since 9/11, have been very unconventional. So they're not like, you're not going to see a signing a peace treaty, like we did at the end of World War II with Japan. But we have this historical notion and this narrative that that's how wars officially end. And the thing is that they don't. And wars take different sort of forms. Back when I was in government, the Obama administration tried to end the war by declaring that combat hostilities are over. And they took a very legalistic sort of approach, which that was their way of saying the war is over. Even though you still have people there, the war is over, and we're no longer doing offensive operations, which was true, unless they were against, Al-Qaeda or ISIS or were in active self-defense. But being able to explain that and have that resonate with a large segment of the population, even people who follow the news and do other stuff like yourself, it gets lost. And because you kind of keep having this, we're in this forever war, we're in this forever war. We've got troops all over the world. And they're all over the world, even doing special operations and other sorts of stability operations. We're still in Korea, and there's a large base there. And so to say that, when you use the word war, you have this certain context in your mind where you're kind of in these prolonged, intense battles, and you're not. You haven't had that sort of fighting in Afghanistan for many, many, many years. You would have certain sort of either targeted strikes where you'd be going after a certain individual, or you'd have certain conflicts that would escalate, but they wouldn't last more than just a day or so. So you're not having these big sort of operations that we view in a historical context. And that's just based upon the education we have, based upon our understanding. And we've just done a very poor job of explaining that and painting that picture, because it's difficult. It's very, very difficult because it's very opaque and it goes against your kind of conventional thinking. That's a long answer to your short question.
No,
because I've seen these conflicts evolve both in Iraq and Afghanistan to where we were doing intense operations for prolonged periods of times, be they weeks or months. And I've been in areas during the proverbial surge in Iraq in 06, 07, 2006, 7 Baghdad, where you had 20 U.S. getting killed a day. And we had suicides that were really high. It was just like a bloodletting. And for that 15, 18 months, that one tour I had, that was, in my mind, of all the 10 years I've spent deployed, that 15, 18 months in Baghdad was it resonated the most in terms of what you think in terms of convention, in terms of war, because it was so intense. It was in an urban setting. It was in Baghdad, and that was just horrific. But in these other sorts of as they evolve, and particularly Afghanistan, what makes Afghanistan so challenging is that it's very rural. It's a rural. There are city centers, but much of the fighting happens out in the countryside, and so as a result, that adds to the opaqueness of it all as well. And I just think we've done a very poor job of explaining that and what these wars actually are and how they end. We like to use these black and white terms when all of these conflicts, at least that I've been involved in, are gray to some degree, and how you then deal with them, except for this thing we had in August, which is a very clear and definitive end for better or for worse.
So speaking towards the grayness.
And let me just interrupt me. Whenever I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me if I'm not, I'm trying to provide context, but if there's certain questions that come to mind, just ask, because I'm trying to kind of provide at least the background for this stuff, so you have an understanding, at least my perspective on how I see it.
I love it. But so you talked about the degrees of grayness. One thing I've heard some people say about the idea of Afghanistan itself is, we think of these places as countries, kind of like, United States and Canada are countries with these political borders. Yeah. And that over there, we can look at a map and that there's these borders of Afghanistan, but it's not even necessarily a country from the same way in which we would define country. Like, how do you make sense of a statement like that?
Again, we all come to things with our own preconceived notions or understandings, or even more important, expectations. And while Afghanistan is a country, its borders are very, very porous. It's not like going over to Mexico or going up to Canada, particularly on its eastern side with Pakistan, which is just, it's mountains. Given the groups that we were combating there, they utilize those sorts of we call them seams, to kind of be able to kind of establish themselves and exploit. And a lot of times they being various insurgent groups, knew that our authorities, because let me just take a little thing. We always talk about troop numbers. What's more important is actually the legal authorities you have to engage with them. But a lot of these insurgent groups knew our authorities were right to the border with Afghanistan and that we couldn't go into Pakistan. So that would be a known seam that would be exploited for sanctuary. And that was done all the time, and has been done for centuries, because it's like a no man's land, and so it's a very, very difficult place to engage with people. And it's not only military engagement, but it's also the Afghan peoples and Pakistani peoples in that area. It's their own boundary of some sort, which cuts them off from other sorts of engagements, and why you kind of get these tribal rivalries, or why you get these different sorts of sects that have their own worldview. We talk about our perspectives and our worldview, and it's relatively broad. For them, it might be very, very small. Again, given the geography that they're in. One of the things that's really changed Afghanistan, I think, for better and for worse, is the cell phone. And now that they're able to start communicating beyond the 20-mile or 50-mile radius that they lived much of their life. But with regards to it being a country, it is a country, and I wasn't involved in these discussions early on after 9/11, but they were trying to think of some sort of governing structure, and whether it should be viewed as regionally, different regions of Afghanistan. What sort of, and people criticize there being kind of like a central government that was established after 9/11. And there's always been some sort of either president or king of sorts, but what sorts of control they actually have has always been, many ways, determined by personality as opposed to institutions. And that was something that I recognized early on, because a lot of times we, U.S. government, would think that, okay, we're engaging with now the president or a minister of Afghanistan, and he or she, primarily he, should be able to do X in their country. But you know what? They don't have the capabilities really of doing those sort of things. And you'd have a misalignment of expectations, and you'd have frustrations and anger. Well, why can't you do this, and all this other stuff? And their politics and their capabilities and their institutions are much different than ours. And many times we can't do stuff. We talk, our ability to implement certain policies many times have different consequences than what you expect or what you intend. And it's even more so with these countries that we were fighting in. And it's then even more so given the geography and the newness of the government that's there. And that's why I always thought that this is going to be a long, long issue. I mean, I engaged a lot during the last 2.5 years with the leadership of the Afghan government. And I had an appreciation for their limitations. And they would have an ability or inability to carry out what they want or don't want. And in my mind, it was, engage with them on a certain issue. Don't drive them crazy over it, because you only have so much political capital. And as long as what they're doing doesn't negatively affect our U.S. national security interests or what our mission is in any real damaging way, I was like, fine. There was like a right-left limits that I had, and also that because I advise the military quite a bit, that I would say they have right-left limits. And even if they say yes, they're going to say yes to make you happy. They might be able to do it. They likely won't. So let's not hinge everything on that, and let's not fall on our sword for this sort of thing. And so I went about things that way, just because I knew the government likely couldn't do a lot of the things that we wanted them to do. And I chalked that up to a lack of capacity that they would have to do it. And sometimes, they'd be able to call up another family member or a tribal member, or have other sorts of non-traditional government acts to kind of influence something, and you let that happen, and that's fine. So I had a much looser definition of these things, and I didn't kind of hold everything tried and true with kind of how they follow what the Afghan government structure is. You definitely wanted to try to empower it, but you also had to recognize what its limitations were.
Are there institutions in Afghanistan today? Everyone, I'm aware that the Taliban has taken over.
Yeah.
What do their institutions look like? And
so the short answer would be yes. But what form they are, because they announced something where they're putting certain people in as their kind of Ministry of Interior, which is like their Homeland Security, their Ministry of Defense, which is like our Department of Defense, their NDS, which is kind of like our CIA or other sorts of intel services, National Directorate of Services, or NDS. So they have people there. And some of them actually that used to be head of terrorist organizations that we combated, like Haqqani Networks, is now head of the police, which is just great to hear. And there's an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about this guy the Taliban guy who we kept trying to find and target, who carried out a whole host of attacks against us, who's now the chief of police of Kabul. So you have them kind of falling into these institutions, but how they're then able to govern is a different thing, and whether they actually have enough people to carry things out. Being an insurgency is much different than governing. And so this is where there's going to be a real disconnect. Again, going back to expectations.
You talked about the United States mission. You've been consulting over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah.
What was the United States mission?
The primary mission was to secure the homeland, if you're looking for a tagline. So it was to make sure that another 9/11 type event doesn't happen either against us or our allies. And that was primarily NATO. And then you also had Australia and New Zealand. That was the primary goal. And to make sure, again, going back to those points I raised earlier, you didn't want those transnational terrorist groups to develop a certain capability to where they can export it and carry out attacks against us. That's the baseline premise. And in my mind, and this is kind of what I say to myself, we successfully executed that mission. We prevented that from happening, and we prevented another attack from happening.
And so
that gives me at least some sense of like, I'm proud of the work I did. other people who served there should be proud of the work we did because we were able to carry out and successfully carry out that critical national security mission.
So if my understanding is correct, it's, the Taliban didn't create Osama bin Laden. The Taliban didn't really have anything to do with Osama bin Laden, but the Taliban was loosely running Afghanistan, and they would look away from the activities of, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and that's what caused 9/11. Do you think that the Taliban has learned its lesson and isn't likely to let anti-American activities happen there again for fear of,
possibly, and there'll probably be there's elements in there that think they have or have. The question is whether they'll be able to do it. Again, it goes back to capability. They may say, yes, we will not let Al-Qaeda reestablish itself in Afghanistan. But to be able to actually then enforce that is a completely different issue. You also might have elements in there that actually are trying to, and they might not be, known as Al-Qaeda to them. This is another gray area is like with ISIS that we got there, another gray area because these insurgent groups kind of change colors and change names and all this other stuff. In many ways, what you're trying to do is mitigate this intent they have of being able to carry out these attacks. And we put these different titles on them and all this other stuff for various reasons. But again, it goes back to the issue of whether the Afghanistan government has the intent and the capability to mitigate against those threats. And frankly, I don't know. They say that they do. That's nice. I don't necessarily I don't take that at face value. I don't take anything at face value. I listen to a whole bunch of different things and I assess things myself. But like being able to successfully attack those sorts of groups is very, very difficult. It was very, very difficult for us. Now, they have different sorts of capabilities that we don't have, but whether they'll actually be able to do that, I don't know. Even though there might be some of the leaders that say, yes, we're going to go do this, or we intend to extinguish this group or make sure this group doesn't. I just don't know whether they'll be able to, even if they say the right thing. And I'm sure many within there will not say the right thing. So it's going to be a very, very difficult time. It's going to be very difficult for us to have a real understanding of that because we have our ability in order to understand that nuance is pretty much gone because we've left. Let me just back up a little bit, give you another historical thing. Bin Laden came in there in the 90s and he purposely didn't inform Taliban leadership of the whole 9/11 attack. And so the issue was then whether, and even if they did, I don't know what they could have done, but even then, after the attacks happened, the justification for going in was that the Taliban wouldn't hand them over. And so that was the judgment call that the Taliban made it the thing. Now, whether they learned from that, maybe. And there are some people that were still at the leadership at that time, 20 years ago, that are now back in leadership here. And I've been in any of the talks, at least recent talks with them. They say they've learned that lesson, but whether that's actually the case or not, I'm not sure. So I just want to provide that context.
Do you think the Taliban could have turned him over? I mean, would it have been?
I do.
You do?
I do. Okay. They knew where he was. And they chose not to based upon certain Islamic principles.
Okay. Sort of like a camaraderie among jihadists.
It's kind of like I can't remember the actual Pashto word for it, but it's kind of like if you have a guest in your house, you take care of and protect your guest. But Bin Laden had been thrown out of a number of countries based upon other attacks that he orchestrated earlier. And the fact that he was in Afghanistan while organizing the 9/11 attacks for over 2 years, had that been known, I think that would have changed the dynamics, because he was even somewhat of a pariah among certain Islamic groups because of then the trouble that usually came following whatever he was planning and carrying out. And that's why he got kicked out of various countries before he got to Afghanistan. But the Taliban had a much more strict interpretation of Islamic law, of being able to protect those who you've accepted in. And so that was the judgment call that was made at the time. Even though, looking back on history, there was a lot of debate within the Taliban leadership on whether to do that or not at the time.
How important was finding and killing Osama bin Laden?
On its face, I think it was very important because, again, it goes to something that, one, I think needed to be done. Two, it was something that clearly showed that we had done something against this sworn enemy of ours. Conversely, killing him didn't solve the problem of or extinguish the transnational terrorist groups that emanate from that part of the world that threaten our national security interests. And I think a lot of people, and I know there was a lot of debate inside the government and the administration at the time, Obama administration, of whether then that was the time to kind of get and go, because it was something that was visible. It was something that was high profile. It was something that would resonate with the American people. It would be a clear delineation. There was a quote, because I had just left government at that time. It ended up my first tour in Afghanistan, and some Washington Post reporter reached out to me, and I was the final quote in this long article saying, "And the war continues." Because in my mind, just killing one person in that type of unconventional war doesn't necessarily mean it's over, because these groups continue to evolve and metastasize and things like that. And you have to constantly provide pressure on them, or else they will develop. Now, did that strike severely weaken Al-Qaeda? Absolutely. And it's still been degraded since then. But I think that's a testament to continuous pressure that you put on. You can't just cutting off the head of the snake isn't going to kill the snake in this regard. It's going to continue to grow, because you're not necessarily just fighting against a certain person or even a certain group. You're fighting against more of an ideology of sorts, that gets lost on people.
And Richard
and
Clark,
it also just doesn't make good politics.
You obviously remember Richard Clark, right?
Yeah.
He referred to Al-Qaeda as a multi-headed hydra. Is that a good way of?
I think that's fair. And what you've seen with this whole ISIS, development, it's metastasizing. It's evolving into different things. Now you get at, and then what they then did in Iraq in 2011, what ISIS did by taking over Mosul, and also when we left Iraq, so these groups kind of change, and it's that part of the world that continuously ferments these things. And that's why, in my mind, we had to stay there, even in relatively small numbers, just to kind of maintain a constant pressure and a presence. Because a lot of times, one of my big takeaways, because I spent 10 years deployed, spent 4 years in Iraq, 6 years in Afghanistan, is that the perception of force is many times much more important than the application of force. And it's just our presence there and the psychological impact that it has that provides second and third order effects that help you carry out your mission. And as we learned in Afghanistan, you could have a conflict or a war, it was actual war then, where you had over 100,000 people, and you were still able to maintain that perception when you were down to 5,000 people. And that's an important thing. That's an incredibly important thing. Now, were you able to do as much? No. But that mental perception and what you're able to do with that is incredibly powerful. And that gets lost on us, particularly in this day and age. It gets lost on us given the politics that we have. It gets lost on us given social media and how we see and view events. But that perception is really, if I don't mind, I can give you a story from Iraq and during the surge. So I was a political advisor for Baghdad during the surge and the U.S. military division that was in charge of that.
Working directly under Bremer?
Well, Bremer was there.
What exactly was your role?
And so for Iraq, I spent two tours there. I spent one for 2 years and one for like 16, 17 months. And the first one was with Bremer in part, being an advisor to the Iraqi Minister of Interior, so like the Iraqi Homeland Minister, Homeland Defense, and who was in charge of all the police. And being embedded with him and there was a group of us that were kind of like, we wanted to get away from all of the politics and BS that was going in the Coalition Provisional Authority Palace, the U.S. governing authority there that Bremer ran. And we were so like, why is anyone just like working with the Iraqis all the time? And so we kind of repositioned ourselves outside the palace, out to the ministry, out to another sort of a palace where the minister was the whole time, and just embedded ourselves with him. And so that we viewed our ability to kind of then provide, advisory services to them directly because we were with them and other people within the ministry literally all the time. And then we were able to provide a conduit then to military, the State Department Diplomatic Corps, and the intelligence services. So it was a fascinating perspective to be in at that point. And we're talking, I got there, left, I think I started doing everything like the end of 2003, beginning of 2004. I was there for 2 years. And so that was my job for 2 years. And it was fascinating. And I was coming at it from someone who had no government experience, for better or for worse. But I was in this position where I was able to see a lot and have then access to a whole host of U.S. government agencies who then saw that I was this important conduit to an Iraqi leader. And it was fascinating, absolutely. And I had a great group of folks around me. And even though that was an incredibly difficult year, I thought our approach to it was, and it turned being just a complete cluster on so many levels. But at least our approach to that, I think, was very unique and beneficial to the mission, even though it was a mess.
So you were just about to tell a story about the surge.
So then my second tour, since I worked with the military, engaged with the military a lot, I was asked to kind of go out and work with the military division, which is a unit size, which generally has about like 10,000 soldiers in it. But during the surge, it like expanded like 40,000. It ended up being the largest division in U.S. military history. And during the real height of a lot of the fighting that was going on. Anyway, so there was a lot of debate that was going on whether to send these additional 30,000 U.S. soldiers into Baghdad or not. And huge political debate. And Bush was pushing for it. In terms of just application, 30,000 soldiers in a city of 6 million, I think it was at the time, isn't that much. But the perception of that was massive. And what I saw was that the louder the debate got in Washington, because it was fierce. This is in 2006, while everyone thought everything was just completely lost and just like leave now and just like it. Bush, to his credit, says, we're doubling down, we're going in. And that message, and the perception of sending those forces in, even before the first surge additional brigade went in there, you had this cascading effect that I was able to track, and a number of us were able to track, of where you saw these insurgent cells go to ground or go back to Iran or just disperse because they were like going, holy shit, this is we can't survive this. Let's like regroup and just lay low and all this other stuff. And the fact that we said we were sending these and there was no timeline put on it, you were able to have this sort of effect, this psychological effect that gave you momentum going into that you really can't. We tried to quantify it, but I don't think we really were able to. But that you can't quantify on the battlefield and in terms of the political dynamics. Now, Bush, and this George W. Bush paid a huge political cost at the time of that. But he made the decision, for right or for wrong, but he made the decision to do this, and I'm going to use my political capital to try changing the course of the war in Iraq. And that had an immense effect. Because one of the problems that we've had in these wars, and I'm going down various rat holes, so stop me if the various problems you have with these wars are certain things that are done to satisfy political constituencies in the U.S. There's certain, Afghans do certain things to satisfy their political constituencies. Aligning the timing of these things is immensely difficult, if not impossible. And so while, kind of like the Obama surge, Obama agreed to do a surge, but he put a timeline on it because he needed to satisfy a political constituency back in the U.S., for better or for worse. But that has an effect. And I think Bush's calculus was like going, I'm just going to take the bullets almost literally, on doing this without a timeline, because I want to put that into Iraq, as opposed to kind of straddle and come up with some sort of political balance. And that's a calculus, that's a political call, and I got it. But it's that psychological effect that's so important, and so rarely do you have U.S. leadership or others that kind of go, I'm just going to do anything that's necessary to have an impact on the ground in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever. Because a lot of times people are hedging and speaking to different audiences and then in the case of Afghanistan, they interpret those things in a different way. And they're like, all right, well, we'll just wait this out. They're going to start heading out in 18 months or whatever was the timeline that Obama said. And that completely changes the psychological effect on things and your ability to really be able to make some sort of sustainable progress. Now, having said that, even if Obama didn't use a timeline on this thing, would it have had a long-term impact? I don't know. But at the time, those are issues that I look at much more closely and try to raise to leadership and others so that they're given just as much consideration as troop numbers and things like that. Because it's these other sorts of nuance and kind of ambiguous gray issues that have much more of an impact. And we see the flip side of that with what we just saw in Afghanistan, where you just had this kind of like, we're leaving. And it was actually the psychological impact, I think, from that decision that had such a damaging effect. And that gets lost many times in the visuals, and because it's something that's underneath that a lot of people miss.
It almost proves that warning from the George W. Bush era, which was like, if we give them a timeline on when we're going to pull out, it's going to create chaos and hell, and they will, it's going to create different incentive structures. Yeah. And it quite clearly did. So, all right, I got two questions that arise out of your last commentary.
Okay.
One's about Iraq, one's about Afghanistan. How many Americans are in Afghanistan, for better or worse, possibly against their will right now. And do we?
And I don't know that. I have no idea.
Okay.
I truly have no idea. It could be a few hundred. It could be dozens. It could be more. It could be less. I have no idea. There was one time.
I heard a number that was like 10, that we had tens of thousands.
Well, Americans in terms of American citizens. And you think that we'd be able to track this, but there's no requirement, I think, on our side, our US side, of then saying that you're in Afghanistan or you're in some sort of country. And you think that would come up on the passports and stuff like that. It's not known, but I was just going to make this side story. There was one time when I was flying back there and I was going through customs because I was flying commercial instead. And I'm waiting in line. And I see this family of four that are as blonde as possible. And they're Americans and they were missionaries. And they had their, the mother and the father who were probably in their 30s. And then you had their two daughters who were 5 and 8 or something like that. And I'm going, holy cow. Just wow, and just shocking. So are there people like that are there? Maybe, probably. How many of them? I don't know. People are weird, myself included. So it's who knows actually who's there.
And I'm assuming you can't speak to it, but it's just something I'm wondering. Anything. What about those who helped us, who would like to be here, who are going to suffer dire consequences for having helped us? Do you have any sense of that?
I don't know the sense of the numbers. I suspect it's still in the thousands. I have purposely, since I left Afghanistan in March of 2016, I have purposely tried staying disengaged from a lot of the stuff just to move on with my life. And have done so for the most part. But having said that, once everything started going sideways in August, a bunch of people reached out to me asking for help. And I got dragged back. I was actually happy to help them, but it was very, very difficult helping out about 100, 120 of them get out. And I know a whole host of people that work there, like myself and others, that were helping hundreds and thousands of them get out. And I am absolutely certain there are still more that are there that couldn't get out during that very narrow window that they had, given how quickly everything turned. And they're still trying to find either land or air routes out of country. So what that number is, I don't know, but I'm sure it's in the thousands.
Can you speak to the mechanics at all of how you helped them get out? What did that look like logistically or communicatively?
It was a very, very fluid. It kept changing. So it was a lot of it was done through, at least with the Afghans through WhatsApp. Because while we might have had their cell numbers, being able to call and talk, you couldn't because the cell services, the cell coverage was overloaded, and so we all talked via WhatsApp. But it kept changing because the environment kept changing, and I was back in the thick of things. Where you're going, all right, how are we going to deal with this shit show? And so it was myself and 3 or 4 other guys that I had worked with in the past, primarily other military guys, and then I knew others on the intelligence side. And we would be getting contact from various people. Initially, I was asked to get out this group of women who numbered about 7. And we were like, okay, that's manageable. That sounds fine. And we're trying to figure it out, and they already had SIV visas, the visas that are necessary that the U.S. government provides after an extensive process. Usually it takes years, literally a year to 2 years to get these SIV visas. And that seemed like a relatively easy thing, and things weren't completely chaotic yet. and we're able to get them out. But the complication then came, well, you don't have to get just them out, but you got to get their families out. And so that then expanded the number from 7 to about 50. And then they're in a certain part of Kabul and they're scared to leave. And you've then got to get them from whatever house or safe house they're in to the airport. So then you got to find a driver who's got a bus that can bring them. And one of the guys that worked with us, worked as a contractor in Kabul, and he just knew everybody in Kabul. He was phenomenal. And so he was able to commandeer a bus and driver, but the driver wouldn't do it unless he got out and his family. So the number goes from 50 to 60. And as a result, you got 60, you're probably going to need 3 buses. And it just keeps growing and stuff like that. And so you're like,
and now the bus guy, the guy who provides the bus.
Right. Absolutely. And he's going to leave his bus there, so these people are making their own. For us, we're like going, oh, geez, okay, we got to figure out another 10. And then, but these people are going like, okay, I got to give up my whole life, and so it just adds another layer of complexity. So it's then not only then getting them from a place in Kabul, it's then getting them to various gates. And there were a number of gates around the airport. And Abbey Gate was the one that a lot of people saw on the news, where that explosion happened that killed 13 Marines. And you just saw mobs, thousands of people that were there. But there were other gates as well. And different nationalities control different gates. So the U.S. kind of controlled Abbey Gate. The Brits controlled another gate. The intelligence community controlled another gate. And so you had different gates, and some of them were known and some of them weren't. Some of them were really busy and some of them, And so it was then not only just then getting them to the gate, it was then having someone on the other side of the gate who could then identify these people and then open the gate for them in a mob. So then there's that. But then they also then need paperwork. And so then being like State Department paperwork. And so being able then to have contacts into state or be able to if they already had their paperwork, that made things a lot easier. And then other contacts at the State Department, who then could get their paperwork and then provide provisional sorts of visas and all this other stuff. And then get it to State Department officials who are inside the wire. And then if you're able to do that, get someone then open the gate, get them, then get them on a plane. And so there's all of these different hoops, and the environment kept changing because certain gates would be open, sometimes they would literally wait in the bus for 2 days, 3 days, waiting to for the gate, and they didn't want to leave because we finally get them. Other times there was some of the family members who we were like, you got to go now. We've got a window to get you there within an hour. And they'd be apprehensive about stuff, and understandably so, but we're like, you got to go. Because then there's then Taliban checkpoints that were around the base, and we were able to get information on when they shifted and all this other stuff so that we could get people through. And then there were different people who we knew on the inside who left. And so we lost contacts, and we had to reestablish contacts with others who we knew on the inside who could open up the gate. And they had to it was just everything. Nothing is simple. And but it's those sorts of issues that I'm like, going, all right, let me see who I know in my network that might be able to lead me to so-and-so who can get me this and get me that. And so really it came to being a lot of the guys and gals who worked there who knew people who were still in government or knew others who could then put us in contact with them and help us out on the inside. So it was just, it was crazy for about 10, 12 days or so.
Are these 120 some odd people here now?
Not all of them, no. Some of them are, because they they had family members. So there's one situation where these three girls, and their mother, who was Afghan, was in New York, and the father, who was Afghan as well, was in Kabul but dead. And the SIV visas, if I understand this correctly, the SIV visas for the girls were in the father's name, and he's dead. And the mother has one, but she's already away. So then the issue was being able to get the girls, get them into another group that we were helping with, and get them out. And so, because then like after we got out that initial group of 60 or so, then there were other groups of 20 or 30 that we worked with. And just because of resources and being able to, we kind of cobbled a bunch of them together to then, and you'd all be texting them on WhatsApp to kind of go, all right, go to this gate and just wait. And then we'd be talking with, and like literally it would be dozens of hours they'd be waiting. And you'd just hope and pray that a bomb wouldn't go off at the gate. And some of them would get scared and leave because we're trying to get a person on the inside to open up the gate and let in the van, or have them get off the van and come in. And so those three girls did come back in, but a lot of them then fly then to the Emirates, and there's been processing camps that have been set up for them and things like that. And there's been others that have gotten back that were contractors that we got that I know are back in Virginia and other areas. So yeah, it's a mix.
Do you mind if I ask? I mean, I know you won the award for heroism. You were issued that by Hillary Clinton, and I know that you must process stress on just a different level or way than most people do. Like, do you have any sense of mindfulness about yourself as your because I'm imagining that while I'm sitting there talking about it with friends and we're having our stupid fucking political opinions about, is this pull out the right thing, and was Trump smart about it, is Biden smart about it, are they both stupid about it, and everyone sitting here trying to feel smart, and you're fucking engineering the safe harbor and passage for 120 people out of there. Like what's your personal stress level as your?
I don't watch the news. I try not watching the news.
No, I'm not talking about stress level about the news.
But I'm serious. That's what pisses me off more than anything else. I'm just like, I don't need to hear this bullshit. And so in some ways, helping those people out allowed me just to kind of like work through things, kind of like going, just listen to all the yelling and bickering, and you did this wrong and you did that wrong, and this is the blame. I was like, fuck it all. The fact that then I was like going, all right, and I was hiking at the time, so I hike a whole bunch, so that helps out with stress. But the fact that I was actually able to do something or be part of this group that was helping them out helped out tremendously. Just be like going, regardless of the decisions that were made and whether they were right or they were wrong, I'm going to do my part to try helping this thing out and try, it was a small issue. So being able to do something helped mitigate that and helped kind of like, all right, fuck it. I'm going to focus on this. After a while, then I got pissed off because I'm like going, helping these people out, and it just doesn't end. There's just more and more and more. Well, that kind of pissed me off after a while. But I mean, in terms of like maintaining stress and stuff like that, one of the things, particularly during deployments, thank God I can laugh about the most absurd things ever, and so that's like my therapy at the time was just like, you gotta be fucking kidding me, and if you have like a group of folks that are around you where you're just like, this is fucking insane. And you're like, okay, here we go. And if you're able to do that, it really kind of helps, at least in my case, and many of the people that I worked with, to kind of work through all the bullshit that you deal with. And so that's the stress mitigator. And now I just walk thousands and thousands of miles, which is
So you said you were hiking at the time of this. You weren't just hiking like Mount Sanitas in Boulder, Colorado, on a 1.5 miles up and back. Like, where were you?
I was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. So it's like a 2,600 mile trail. And I was where was I? I was near Crater Lake in Oregon when things started kind of going sideways. And I went to a town. When I got to Crater Lake, I got a ride to some town. So I had reliable cell service, and just like was talking with everybody, and people are kind of like going, hey, it's when the discussion started happening on whether, do you know some ways to get out? Do you know ways to get into the airport and all this other stuff? I'm like, I don't know. And so you'd start talking with other people who you worked with, and you'd be like going, and it would come up in conversation and like going, yeah, we got this, we figured this out, but we don't know. And then from that, I then went back hiking a little bit, and I'm like going, I got to get off for a few days in order to have reliable coverage and kind of work that issue. Because the guys that I was engaging with most of the time, they were all over the place. And so all of us were remote. And so I just jumped off and focused on that for a little while, which was good. And then I got back hiking, and I finished up in Canada, now 2 weeks ago or so. So
wow. So
it's great. It's great. I just listen to my audiobooks, and I just hike 23 to 27 miles a day, and I'm in my little bliss.
But in the process of helping those people, those days that you're sticking in the towns for the cell coverage, what
I tried doing in this whole situation as well is that in my mind is like, you got a fucking hour, you got to move your ass, right? That's going on in my head.
Okay.
But I also then, the other split mind to me is like going, they're scared. They don't know what's waiting for them. They're the ones that got to go out on the street and go through these various checkpoints and go into the mob. And so I'm not telling them you got to fucking go and do this stuff. You want to be direct. And there was a friend of mine, John, who was doing a lot of that stuff with them, and you're trying to get them going, and then they would or they wouldn't. But he's done this stuff as well. He's a retired Army colonel. He understands, the challenges that they're going through as well. And so you try to be mindful of that, but there was also a point in our discussion where we're like going, they might not make it, and that you've got this deadline coming up, because I doubted it was going to be extended where they were going to pull out everybody. And I'm like going, they've got another window that we can generate, maybe 2. And after that, it's not. And then if you can't, you then have to, at least I do, rationalize that you've done everything you can, and that it just can't happen. And that was an issue that we had with this last bus. There was a last bus that we were trying to get through about 2025. And we got them to this gate, and they were literally the next bus to get through. And they weren't letting anybody else out because they were pulling up within 5 hours, and we couldn't get them through, and they had to go back. And you're just like, fuck, because you're trying everything. And, the guy who you're been engaging with for the past 4 days to open up the gate is retrograding, is leaving, and you don't have time to find somebody else, and there isn't somebody else, let alone then other U.S. personnel on the inside to process them and get on a plane. There's no, and you're just like, and they waited for 3 days there to get in, to move up and to get in, and they couldn't get in. And that's hard, particularly since they did everything as well in their capability and the timeline ended.
So this brings me to a sentiment that I've had, and I don't know, and it feels almost so fruitless to even flex an opinion about our situation or the pullout or whatnot. But, for me, aside from you, my only personal connection to Afghanistan is we had a couple of van drivers who used to take us to our crew hotel in Seattle. And they were relocated Afghani interpreters who helped the United States military or government interpreters. They couldn't read or write English, but they could speak English. Yeah. These guys were the nicest, most generous, grateful people. I mean, here's guys who are probably making 1/10 what I make money wise. Yeah. Offering to, would you like my wife to bring you food? Would you like to try some of our food? And just, seeking connections and in the current political zeitgeist before Afghanistan and the pullout, just the question of whether or not American ideals or values matter, or if this is a good country or not, to see people like that come over here who are so grateful to be here and the opportunities that they have, and to know, to then reflect back on like what a small amount of force it took for us to stay here. And I don't know, I've heard numbers. What are we were spending now $10 to $18 billion a year to stay in Afghanistan. But like, I have a hard time coming to any other conclusion that, if in an all voluntary military force, people who get in know that they're going to have the skin in the game, they're doing it presumably, I've heard, because it satisfies some type of meaning and purpose in their life. I'm assuming we were making lives better for people in Afghanistan just by being there with that smaller force, like you talked about, that the small force can have a big effect. It seems like we just gave up on any type of ideological supposition that our values matter in the world, of the values of ensuring the liberty of individuals, and just gave the fuck up because it costed too much. And here we are, we're out. And I'm frustrated, and I don't know how to make sense of it. Yeah.
And it's difficult to make sense of. I just try not to dwell on those things, because those are issues that you can just keep running around in your head. And I've had so many of those. I kind of like other things I can't focus on, that, or else I'll just be in this perpetual spin. And that's why, like, when I left Afghanistan, I was like, done. I went hiking. I hiked the Appalachian Trail, and I'm just like, and if, people ask, oh, so what do you do? What did you do? I go, I'm a lawyer, and no one wants to talk to me, which is perfect. And so, or else they're just constant. And a lot of people kind of have these things where they keep thinking. And we were talking about psychology. In many ways, you can be your own worst enemy, because you keep spinning and spinning and spinning, and your whole life gets literally wrapped up in those thoughts.
This podcast is a creative endeavor fueled by my interests and curiosity. If you're still listening at this point in the conversation, I'm hoping that on some level you find listening to be of some value. All I ask in return for your enjoyment of this podcast is to share it with someone. Anyone. Social media would be great, but sharing it with one friend would still be doing me a favor. I'm really enjoying this journey I'm on in creating this content. The best way you can help me is by subscribing to my podcast and my YouTube channel and sharing this content with others. Thanks so much for helping.
Two thoughts came to mind when you were talking about that. One, with a lot of the Afghans and Iraqis as well from earlier, and you're right, they're people who get up and move here with very little, if not nothing. And in my mind, I put that in perspective of, when we complain about the cable not working, or, the car needing to be fixed, or whatever, it is nothing. It is minor compared to like what these folks have. have to deal with. And I kind of keep that in mind, and it kind of helps, again, put things in perspective. Point number two, I have 3 points actually. Point number two, you're right. All of the forces and also all of the government, U.S. government that's over there, they're volunteering or voluntarily over there. They joined and took an oath to engage in these sorts of missions. And so you're doing it willingly. And that's where there's a big difference between what these conflicts are or were and what we dealt with in Vietnam, where you dealt with the draft. Now, there's flip sides. All these things have good sides and bad sides, is that now that you have a volunteer force, the people that serve in those things are from a very, very small strata of society, for better and for worse, right? So you don't know many people that are there that have served there because they represent less than 1%, and let alone civilians that serve there, which is even a much, much smaller fraction of that sort of thing. So you just don't have those sorts of engagements to kind of help explain these things, at least from perspectives of people that were there. And I think that also, now that I think about it, that also lends to some of the lack of understanding that goes on. And the third point that I was going to raise is that there were lots of criticisms about wasted money and how the mission was a failure and all this other stuff over the decades that we were there. But what's interesting, at least to me, on the flip side, is that now that you're seeing a lot of that good work going away, you're seeing the difference of it. So now you're seeing women being locked up. Now you're seeing, our ability to do anything there come to an end. Now you're seeing certain services come to an end. And it's only by seeing what you don't have do you realize what you actually had. And my hope is that we don't get to that extreme level where you then have some sort of nuclear or loose nuke or some sort of a truly geostrategic issue that happens in Pakistan or elsewhere, where had we had a presence there, we would have been able to at least try to mitigate that. And I hope that's not the case. And that's me just going to a dark place in terms of scenarios. But again, the fact that you're not there, I think you'll gain an appreciation, or I think more people will gain an appreciation. At least you're already seeing in the press that the things that we did do that might not have been fully appreciated are now actually being appreciated more because you're seeing them actually not happen there on the ground.
Unfortunately, it's the only takeaway I'm seeing is people just going, well, we should have learned our lesson in Vietnam. We can't be an occupying force, or we shouldn't be an interventionist. And we were the bad guys, we were the aggressors, and we just made things worse. We should have never went in the first place. And
politically, that's the easy thing to say in today's environment. And that's why I try staying out of these things from a political perspective and just kind of share the points of view that I have based upon that experience, recognizing that's just a point of view. And there are people who make those points, who even aren't political, but make those points and truly believe them. And you try then having a dialogue or listening to them. Because there's a lot of good people that I know that disagree with us having been there. And so have that discussion. One of the biggest compliments I could bestow on anyone is where I fiercely disagree with them on a whole host of things, but I still respect them, and they're still friends or colleagues of mine. And there was a period in my life when I used to engage with the press a lot. It just was like, I quickly learned that you're being brought on to say a certain thing that people want you to say, and it's very rare that you're able to have a extended kind of discussion on things. And that's where I think podcasts are fantastic, where you can kind of have long form discussions, and because this stuff isn't easy. And it's not to say that I'm right and you're wrong and all this other stuff. It's kind of like there's a whole bunch of gray there.
Well,
and people don't have time to, or don't have the patience, and I got it, because there's a lot of stuff.
I couldn't possibly be right. I'm confused.
Right.
And that's, you talked about someone potentially getting lost in thought and just, getting, wrapped around the axle with all these opinions. I mean, I felt myself going there over the last 4 or 5 years of, you go do your job. You've got Trump in office who, I'm still confused about how I feel about Donald Trump. Could some of his, policies have been good? Yeah, possibly. But I don't think that his style of speaking and leadership was good for America. I spent so much time being angry or incredulous at my fellow citizens for, like, how could you support a guy who speaks like this? But then maybe it's social media addiction. Some person from, 3 to 17 years in my past has this opinion that I think is a harmful opinion. And it's like, we're all like weaponizing our opinions and don't really know shit. And so this podcast is, to me, my way to use sort of the creative juices and my inherent gregariousness and my curiosity to try to hopefully have some type of meaningful discussions where maybe I can learn some things, and hopefully anybody who's listening could possibly learn some things too. And so that's the impetus here,
I think that's fantastic. I mean, I purposely don't watch the news that much, if at all, and I'm not on any social media. Yeah. And I've done that consciously because a lot of that stuff is just static. Yeah. And perhaps that's being a product of being in these conflicts for so long. I don't need more bullshit in my life. And there's more to life and there's a better ways of spending my time than hearing people on TV or whatever just kind of scream at one another. And what does it lead to? It just leads to more mental angst in my mind, and I want less angst. Anyway, that's how I'm not on any social media. I'm not on anything. That's why you called me up. I was like, holy cow. And he goes, are you on any? I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on anything. And so I think that helps level you out. Because I think that has been an accelerant to this whole feeling of anger and consternation.
If you're agreeable to doing this in the future, why don't we kind of wrap things up a little bit?
You don't want
dude. Listen. Hang on a second.
Chad's not going to have a chance to speak the whole time. You want Chad to speak a bit more.
Well, first off, I was going to ask Chad like his thoughts here in a second, and Chad can speak up anytime he wants. But Chad's also here to help keep me mentally corralled, or if we need to draw a straight line through something, he's gonna speak up. Dude, have you ever listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History?
Yeah, actually, I started listening to it, and I bought all of them. You buy all of his things for like $70, and I was going to listen to him on the trail, and I was able to get through the first 10 or so. He's fantastic.
I think we could do something. I think a recurring discussion and stories, and I think a lot of people would like to try to understand what the fuck just happened in Iraq and Afghanistan on the same level in which I was intensely curious to listen to 4 to 6 hour sessions of Supernova in the East, Dan Carlin fully unpacking the World War II Pacific theater, from a Japan forward perspective. And I just listened to like 40 hours of it. And that's why I thought it was actually so cool. I was actually thinking of Dan Carlin when you pop that cap on your head, because if you ever seen Dan Carlin be interviewed, he shows up with a cap on his head. Like, dude, Dan Carlin. If I didn't
have the hat on, then there'd be like a glare, and no one wants a glare, So the hat's good.
And the other thing that I was thinking about before this interview, Matt, is John Carlson said about the Marines. Did you listen to the John Carlson one?
I did.
I love that.
Which was fantastic.
Yeah. But the thing that he said about the Marines, which I'm kind of feeling like with you, it's like he said about the Marines, I got a lot more out of it than it got out of me. And I'm kind of feeling like this is such a unfair transaction. Like, I am getting so much more out of this than you're getting out of me. But like, dude, if you find this at all enjoyable, I'm all in. I will keep going and keep going. I will have these conversations as often.
Let's talk about it. It'd be good. I think it is. There's part of me that wants to just like move on with my life, and there's another part of me that also feels like it is, because I did have a very unique perspective for an ungodly long period of time. People ask me if I want to write a book and do all this other stuff, and I'm not there yet to write a book. I know exactly the book that I would write.
I feel like conversations are easy.
The conversations are easier. No one knows who I am, but there's a lot of personalities who I engaged with throughout those, both known and unknown, that really impacted me. Because one of the things that stood out from that whole experience are the people, and the colorful people that, and just like everyone who's there, myself included, are a bit odd. We're a little bit off, and some more than others, particularly the Afghans or the Iraqis that I dealt with, and some of the warlords and stuff like that. They're survivors, more so than anything else. And you're like going, holy cow, how did this guy survive through all this other stuff, and how they're able to maneuver and all this other stuff. And what they saw. I mean, in college, I was a history major, and I'm still a student of history in many ways, and love just like learning from these guys, and just like yourself, just like learning what these people have had to say and what they experienced. And I was like, so what was that like? There's this one guy who I used to engage with regularly. He was the guy who brought Bin Laden into Afghanistan, and was the one who kind of welcomed him in. And he's still a warlord. I suspect he's still there.
And you know him.
Yeah. And he looks like Santa. He looks like Santa. How could this be such a bad guy? He looks like Santa. But you're like going, holy shit. And there's like an insurgent group named after him in the Philippines or Indonesia.
Well, do you think
you're like going, holy cow, this guy is 1 degree removed from why we're here. And he's been there because there was like this group of like, now some of them are killed, but 5 or 7 warlords that have been shaped Afghanistan, relatively modern Afghanistan, say over the past 40 years. And this guy was one of them. And you're just like, this guy's got stories. And so you just listen to him. And I also knew that, I'm hearing one perspective on stuff, or I'm hearing what he wants to tell me, but still it's just kind of like going, I think it was my value in a lot of these places to the various people who I worked with, is that I would be able to provide a perspective. In fact, I was there for so long, I was able to provide context, contacts, and then also analysis based upon what I saw, recognizing that what I saw was just a small sliver of stuff. But I was able to kind of share that. And it's what made the job absolutely fascinating. Even though it was maddening every single day, but wars bring out the best and the worst in people in so many ways every day. And being able to be part of that, being able to experience that, is what made the experience so memorable. It was never anything that I planned whatsoever. I don't think anyone would plan to be in war zones for a decade. That's again a long answer to your short question.
No, that's great. That's a great answer. You say perspective a lot, and honestly, you may have more perspective on Iraq, Afghanistan, Middle East politics than probably anyone, and yet you still are looking for more or broader perspective. Where does that come from? Is this a little bit OCD, or is this some kind of a big, broader philosophy of life? Are you?
I think it's a curiosity thing. I think it's a curiosity thing.
Okay.
And I'm always looking to learn more. And that's why I said, I think at the beginning of our discussion, I was like, it would have been great to be in Afghanistan in the 90s when the Taliban were in control. It would have been great to be in Iraq during Saddam's time and just hear how things were I had that thing. So because you hear things after the fact.
Right.
And that history influences then your contemporary viewpoint. And I would love to have been able to see it myself. I love just being able to see things myself. Let me decide on my own, or let me learn on my own. And that's why I would have loved to. There's a mentor, a close friend of mine, this guy named Ron Newman. And I so fortunately met early on, as a career Foreign Service ambassador, met him early on 2004 in Iraq. And he was the head of this section called the Political Military Section. And he would lead up. And then after his appointment there, he went to Afghanistan and became ambassador to Afghanistan. And what made him, he was just a great guy, but what made him so fascinating, and I engaged with him a lot after his tenure in Afghanistan finished, and then he would come back to Afghanistan in a private capacity, is that his father was also ambassador there in the 60s and 70s. And so he would go and visit him in Kabul and would tell stories about driving, him and his girlfriend, then the future wife, would drive in a VW wagon, from Kabul out to Bamyan, which is this area, kind of the north center part of the country, and go up to the north and all this other stuff and go fishing and all this other stuff. And you're going, that's awesome. And so it had this perspective of Afghanistan in different times, and would have then and he also then had contacts from his father's time and also his time that would have, again, because there's so many layers to this stuff, and you could drive yourself crazy, which I probably have, just learning these things, because people act, and we're all formed by our history. And so being able to better understand that, you then can kind of better understand where a person's coming from. Like, one of the big things I enjoyed from these times is, we all do things for various reasons, or we're motivated by certain reasons, or we're brainwashed for certain reasons. I mean, you're a soldier, you become focused to do a certain mission that you normally wouldn't do. And the same thing goes with like terrorist cells or militias and all this other stuff. They're told certain things that motivate them to do various things, and they're done for either ideological or financial or family or whatever. But learning those things are then a very effective way of then trying to change them, or at least kind of broaden their perspective a bit. Sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. But I greatly enjoy, and I met with a number of like insurgent group leaders and some fighters, and some would be held interrogated, and other times we'd have discussions. I met with Taliban members, and you gain a understanding of why they do what they do. And there's a reason why. A lot of times we just kind of like go, that's, they're a certain terrorist organization and fuck them. And many times, understandably and rightly so. But I like to kind of peel back the onion a bit. So like this story, Scott, if I'm going on too many stories, we can stop.
No. Dude, just like Chad asked you why you keep broadening this perspective, and you talk about curiosity, right?
Yeah.
This podcast for me is all about following my curiosity, like wanting to know what makes people tick. And I have an intense curiosity of like, I want to be able to I loved reading Mattis's book, Call Sign Chaos, Learning to Lead. And one of the things that we've talked about in the past was, whether or not Mattis's perspective was right. I'm like, hey man, we shouldn't have fucking disbanded the Iraqi army. We should have hired them, paid them, put them on the payroll so that they could have been the stabilizing force and whatnot. And there are so many different ways to understand things. And as long as the curiosity is there for me, I feel like it can be kind of a sincere thing, but I've got a lot of curiosity about a lot of other things. Chad and I, we've got a couple of different interviews coming up. My plan is to not turn my focus into the Matt Sherman show, but I think that there is enough, that there is enough material and enough curiosity and enough unpacking of the whole fucking shit show that happened over the last 20 years that I think there's a lot of genuinely great material here if you're willing to offer it and engage in it. I don't want to, I mean, like I said before, dude, I freely admit I'm going to get a hell of a lot more out of this than you. But as long as you think that there might be some type of value for people to digest here, I will do my damnedest to honor it as best I can and kind of market it and get it out there.
Yeah, let me finish then on this one story. This is fucked up. You'll love this. This is so there was. Let's just take a break for.
So I sat on a plane the other week coming back with this dude who is a political pollster. He's, he works for some Democratic think tank and he's polling and he's trying to figure out how he can save the world by making it more fair and shit like that. And he asked me, he's like, well, I'll ask you the question, like, where do you get your news from? And I was like, I listen to Lex Friedman. I listen to Eric Weinstein. Occasionally I'll listen to Joe Rogan, whatnot. And he's like, so you don't get it from like MSNBC or Fox or CNN? I was like, no, I kind of feel like I've pierced through the fucking veil and I just see that everything is coming from a certain impetus or slant. And to me, like long form podcasting is the only, it's like a new sincere bastion of, I'd much rather listen to Lex Friedman talk to someone who's working at MIT on AI and how they're integrating things. Like that's how you can get a informed opinion rather than knowing what an FDA wants you to feel about ivermectin, and so so Matt, towards that end, well, you're going to tell us the fucked up story, but towards that end, I'm really honored that you find something sincere in like the long form podcasting. Because I feel like it's like one of the last forces that can help save the planet. I'm not trying to be. We've
lost the ability to like talk with one another in a meaningful way, and so I think this is a way of bringing some of that back. And so I think it's great. Anyway, so this story real quick. So this is like end of 2005, and I'm still advising this ministry, and it had become very sectarian. Like the forces were becoming very Shia dominated against the Sunnis. There's two primary groups. And that's a very broad way of explaining things, but we'll say that for now. And we were getting these reports. This is not a happy-go-lucky story, just so you know. It's actually quite depressing. We get these reports that there were these people that were being rounded up, detained, and tortured at various places around Baghdad, and to a repulsive level. And so we put together an operation to go raid one of them, and you carry out the raid, and you find then in this one facility called a bunker, which was actually built by the Germans during Saddam's time as a nuclear bunker, in case there was a nuclear exchange or other sorts of rockets. There was like 150 people that were being detained and tortured. And you're like, holy shit. I mean, it was just gruesome. And you're talking like hooks, you're talking just really bad stuff. And people just skin just off their backs, and it was just repulsive. It truly was repulsive. And people initially were just brushing it off as like Sunni versus Shia kind of retribution and payback. But I'm like going, there's more to it than this. Those guys were rounded up for a reason, as opposed to just because we were just kind of not writing things off, but we were just kind of simplifying things as Sunni and Shia violence, and that's the Civil War and all this other stuff. But I was like, those guys, those people particularly, were detained for a reason, and it's more than that. And so, primarily, one of the guys that worked with me and myself started then interviewing some of those people, and what you found, and the family, and some of the family members of them, where we could. And what we found was that those people that were being rounded up were either former members of Saddam's Air Force and security forces, or family members of those people, who put down a Shia uprising following the first Gulf War. And this was then the government in power's way of extinguishing this potential threat, because all of them primarily were pilots, of extinguishing that threat so they could never pose a threat again to them. And I was just like, holy shit, there's levels to this that you don't have an appreciation for, that you miss if you just kind of look at the cursory thing. And that there's a reason, and it's not to say that it should be done, but there's a reason for all these things that happen. And if you look through it, you kind of gain a better understanding of why someone does something against another person or another group. And you learn that history and why they do it. And you're like going, geez, this is much broader than anything that's just happened since we had been there in the war starting in 2003. This goes back decades as well. And that really provided me a deeper understanding of how complex these things are. And it made me like I wish I could have seen things back then, or wish I could have had an appreciation or perspective of things back then, so I can kind of have a better understanding of what's fueling all of this stuff. Because in some ways, it certainly was us. But in other ways, there's so much more, and that we don't understand. And when you do something, it has these other, second and third order effects in ways that you could never anticipate. Anyway, that's what I want to do in terms of perspective. And I thought that was something that really resonated with me at that point. Anyway, I know it's hot. I know it's a real knee slapper. It's really.
No, these were the Shias doing this.
This was the government. Yeah, this was the Iraqi government that was in power at the time. Yeah.
Which was mostly Shia, or is it a combination?
Which was mostly
of Shia
at the time. Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of them were, mostly Shia, and a lot of them supported by Iran.
And so, if you were working in Saddam's Air Force, you were a Ba'ath Party member.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How much?
And these people, many of them, were people that were then part of Saddam's Air Force. Because then, so take a step back. So after the first Gulf War, we didn't go into Baghdad, but then there was messages that were put out saying, rise against Saddam internally. And so many of these Shia elements did do that, but then they were bombed and killed. Then this was then that group that attempted to rise up back in the early 90s, attempted to rise up. Now they're in power, and they're like, okay, we don't want these people getting in airplanes again, or because they had the capability to fly. And it's also payback, and we're going to torture them for information and lead to others and all this other stuff.
I watched,
and this was all leading up to some elections that were going on in Iraq at the time. So it was then amplified by that politically. And then there was this minister that was the head of the Ministry of Interior, who I was engaging with a lot. And he holds this then press conference, and he's like going, there was no torture. No one was beheaded. No one was killed. There's no torture. And you're just like, Jesus Christ. And he goes, we did nothing worse than what America did in the Abu Ghraib prisons and all this other stuff, another thing, which is completely wrong. But just throwing that in there to kind of add political fire to everything. And you're just like, Jesus Christ, there's so many different layers to this whole thing. It just it added a lot of context that I had to work with. Yeah.
Plus, their perspective is, you encouraged us to rise up against Saddam.
Yeah.
These guys killed our brothers in arms, and it's time. It's their time to pay the piper.
And this was their way of doing it. And so you're just like, wow. And here I am, in the middle of all this stuff. So that led to me leaving then a few months afterwards, because it was things were escalating to a different level that you just saw things going on a horribly damaging course, and it got worse Not saying that was the beginning of it, but the sectarian strife was really becoming much more amplified. And that was another step in that process.
What can you say about Colin Powell?
He was a great American. And I learned a lot from him, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to work with him. He is someone, and him, and then there was others that were around him who immensely helped me out in my career and helped me kind of initially kind of shape my thinking. And one of the things that he helped me do was, never take things at face value. Always have different perspectives. And he prided himself on having, kind of a group of advisors around him that gave him a whole bunch of different perspectives. And then he decided what to do and the timing of it and all this other stuff. And that was his open-mindedness in that regard. And then his ability to kind of then make those decisions and communicate those decisions was really what made him very unique. But the fact that he listened to different perspectives, that were diametrically opposed, that were out of left field, that were whatever, that was a quality that I looked for in various people who I worked for, whether they have it, because some of them want that and some of them don't. Some of them just want a bunch of yes men. And it was also then a quality that I tried to instill in myself by going, what I'm seeing right now is a perspective. It's not the whole picture. It's a picture. And what can you do to try gaining a fuller picture on things? And that was a life lesson that he shared and that instilled in me from the time when we worked together. I worked with him for about 2 years while he was retired in between his time as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when he retired from the military, and then when he then became Secretary of State under George Bush. And so it was a very, and I'm glad that happened early in my experience or early in my career. So I was able to kind of internalize it and then apply it later in my own life.
Was he instrumental in what got you over to Iraq in the first place?
Initially, yes, but then no. It was, and this is from an experience where I learned like the politics of it all. And many times how we're our own worst enemy. So when I worked with him, he introduced me to Condoleezza Rice, and she put together like this small little advisory group that were mainly her grad students. And so I was part of that. So I kind of helped out the campaign a little bit. Nothing significant. Put together briefing books and research stuff and That was fine. So then when Bush gets elected, and then when the Iraq War starts kicking in, I was like, hey, I'm interested in doing this. But at the time, and like, great. And I kind of like moved through the process and all this other stuff. But then there was this larger bureaucratic battle going on between state and defense at the time, and who would be running things on the ground there. And defense was, and they were putting the block up of anybody that State Department would be recommending or Powell would be recommending or whatever. And so as a result, my affiliation with him put like a complete hold. So there was a thing where like, all right, everything's moving, and asking, so what's the timeline? I was like, oh, you'll be able to leave in about a month and all this other stuff. And I told the law firm, I'm leaving in a month. And then the political decision came, we're not allowing anybody who's, even though I helped out in the campaign and all this other stuff. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And so I then had to go back to work kind of going with hat in hand, going, well, I'm not going. And then through just a weird twist of fate, with some email that I sent, got to the right person, and they helped me get out there about 3 months later, just through a complete and utter fluke that had nothing to do with Powell or anything else. Just a complete fluke, and I was able to get out.
Working for
conversely, there were other people who were, going through a tour in the Pentagon and telling people, well, if you're interested in volunteering for Iraq, I'll be happy to take your name down and all this other stuff. And they got out that way. I mean, it was just completely haphazard with how they got people there, which was just bizarre. And it also just made, also like the people that you have there on the ground, it's just like cats and dogs. And there's a group of people that I had around me that were, and I love them. But they were all, we regard ourselves as the land of misfit toys. And they were just different groups of people from different backgrounds, because we were all civilians and we were never career government people. And had one guy who was, a PhD, but spent his time in SWAT. And he, was this burly, very smart guy, but very tactical guy. You had this other guy who just finished college and, was one who got the job because he went on the tour at the right time. You had others who had some accounting background and that were out there. So you just had like this hodgepodge of people, in addition to military and others. And you're like, okay, here we go. And we're going to try to make something out of this shit show that we're in. And I was actually just saying this because I've been seeing a few of them recently. And even those who I spent just a few months with, 3 or 4 months, you maintain relationships with them. You build up this bond with these people that last decades because you had such an intense and lasting experience, even though with someone that was just a few months, and you fall right back in line and you're just like, hey, what's going on? Da, 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 da. And you share stories from that time. And so it really, that's another thing that I just love from a lot of these is like just the intense bonds and relationships that come out, even from people you might only know for a very short period of time. That's, again, a long story to your short question.
Well, it's kind of evoking what I believe Sebastian Junger said about war. And I don't know if you've read Restrepo. I didn't, but I saw him on the talk show rounds, and it's like his thesis is like those bonds being so strong and the meaning that it evokes is like why there will always be war is because there's like nothing more meaningful that you could be involved with that evokes such a sense of.
In many ways, you're fighting for the guys on the right side and left side, as opposed to some, big national policy or whatever. And it also cuts through all the other bullshit that's out there. And you're like, all right, we got to get through this together. We got to do this stuff. We'll figure out a way of doing it. And then there'll be people that I'll know and love for my whole life that I served with over there.
Chad?
I got 24 more, but you know what? We've gone 2 hours, so it's good.
Yeah. So Matt, like, are you up for scheduling something else in the future?
Yeah, we can schedule something. Maybe like in 2 weeks or something.
All right, dude. Hey, man. Thank you.
Absolutely great talking with you, Scott.
By the way, Sheila says hi. She's got
absolutely
very warm. I'm not even going to honor it by speaking the words of what you were forced to recount or retell, but one of Sheila's maybe favorite memories of the way in which Sister BA would make you get up and recount a telling of a certain mishap. And the funny thing is like, it was like what Sheila's, ephemeral sense of it was like Sister BA was trying to shame you, but you would not be shamed in the retelling of the story. You know what I mean? And there's a difference between like, you might admit that, it might have been a moment of stupidity, but you wouldn't be shamed by the telling of the story.
Right. I lived through it once. I don't need to relive it again. But she actually helped me out tremendously. I mean, I actually reconnected with her recently because I've been on this kind of thank you tour with people who've been important in my whole life, and to thank them, either in person or online, just for what they did to help shape my life. But quick story. This will be very quick. And it's Sister BA, so we have to talk about her. Sister Bernard Agnes, for the listeners who don't know about her. She's like this 6'2" nun who's just imposing, but also just got a heart of gold. And she was the chemistry teacher. And for me, and I remember this in my junior year, it came down to the final. Whether I failed the final, I failed for the year. If I passed the final, I passed for the year. I'm like, oh, geez, this is talk about pressure. And I was just, not the most stellar student. And it was the first time I ever went to any teacher and asked for extra help. And she was like, okay, let's schedule some time. You're going to need at least 2 days after school to kind of walk through all this. I'm like, okay, all right, here we go. So I met with her for 2 days after school, and we went over stuff. I think it was like 2 hours each day. And I didn't know at the time, but she was giving me every question and answer for the final. And I was just like, all right, and I studied for the first time ever in the whole thing. And I took the test, and I got like a 71. And I was just like, yeah. And I'm sure she was even being kind because, again, I suspect her perspective was, I want this kid to pass so I don't have to, I'll have to like teach him over all the summer and stuff like that. And I passed, and I just thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And she helped me tremendously because no one wants to deal with summer school. And so Sister BA is great. And I don't know whether I know that much chemistry still today, but thank you, Sister BA.
That's awesome. She had a unique way of, I think, helping and motivating people. I personally, like you, I definitely was not a committed student. It sounds like I didn't do quite as bad as you on in terms of high school student performance, but I certainly wasn't, in the top, whatever
right.
strata of the class. And I remember she lit a fire under me. I don't think she was trying to lit a fire under me, but there was some big test. I don't think it was a final. It might have been a final, might have been a midterm, but some big test coming up. And she's like, no one's going to get 100 on this. And I was like, why? She's like, because none of you are going to put in the work that it would take to get 100. I freaking stayed up all night studying for that test.
Because she said you couldn't do it. So
she said I couldn't do it. And after the test, she calls me back in her office. She's like, hey, Corley, who invented this theory or whatnot? And I'm like, I said, whoever it is, the wrong answer. She's like, no, it was Niels Bohr. That was the one question you got wrong. And she had my 99 on the paper. It was like, but there was also like, dude, it wasn't my normal effort to get a 99 on a hard test.
She brought something out in you that you didn't know you had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She was great.
Yeah. She was great. She's a great person. And I think she's in Pennsylvania. I want to say she's in Philadelphia.
I
think she's teaching. She's still teaching, I want to say, in Philadelphia or near there.
Wow.
I should send her a note and get together with her because she was great. I think she was one of them who also busted me over at the Bridgewater Commons Mall because what they used to do was take their habits off, and some of us would sneak over there, and then they would come up to you and grab you by the shoulder, and you're like, "Who the hell is this?" And it's Sister So and So without her habit on, her hair's down. You're like, "Damn it, busted again." Those were good times.
All right, dude. Well, next time we will take why don't we, maybe we'll take a more compartmentalized approach and try and stay in one or two rabbit holes and explore like a certain, area and hit me up.
It's been great talking to you, Scott, and Chad. It's been great getting to see you.
Yeah. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, Matt. Thanks.
All right, guys. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Take care.